Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into the classic journey of Morty Smith from Rick and Morty, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up. Let's begin. You've probably heard of Morty before. A shy, stammering teenager with wide eyes and a slouched posture, always trailing behind his grandfather, Rick. He's often the one screaming in the background, running from aliens or questioning the logic of blowing up a planet for a sandwich. But there's something quietly special about Morty that often gets overlooked. Something gentle. Something real. Long before the portal gun and dimension hopping, Morty was just a regular kid in a not-so-regular household. In the morning, he'd wake up to the scent of burnt toast and the chaos of a family always on the brink of emotional collapse. His mom, Beth, brilliant but distant. His dad, Jerry, well-intentioned, but constantly anxious. His sister, Summer, older, sharper, and more independent than he felt he could ever be. Morty lived in the shadows of louder personalities. He was the quiet space between arguments, the soft sigh between dinner table silences. School wasn't much easier. His grades weren't impressive. His confidence was nearly non-existent. Teachers talked over him. Classmates barely noticed him unless it was to laugh when he tripped or stuttered. And then there was Jessica. Morty's heart beat a little louder whenever she walked by. That kind of naive, pure crush where just a passing smile could power him through the rest of the day. Of course, she barely knew he existed. But that didn't stop him from daydreaming, picturing himself rescuing her, impressing her, being someone worth her attention. But life doesn't hand you heroic moments. Not when you're 12 and invisible. Not when you're Morty Smith. Then came Rick. He showed up like a storm with no warning. After years of absence, he reappeared, reeking of alcohol and alien gunpowder, dragging chaos through the front door like it was luggage. And for reasons Morty couldn't quite understand, Rick chose him. Come on, Morty. We're going on an adventure. Morty didn't have time to prepare. No suitcase, no plan, no clue. One second he was getting ready for algebra, and the next he was halfway across the galaxy being chased by jellybean tyrants and time-eating parasites. It was terrifying. But it was also the first time anyone had made Morty feel important. Rick needed him not emotionally, not affectionately, but logistically. He was the human signature that kept their interdimensional travels off radar. He was the tag-along that helped Rick blend in just enough to avoid suspicion. A tool at first. Still, Morty didn't complain. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He was the passenger in something huge, something wild. Something that made his dull, unnoticed days feel like the beginning of a much bigger story. He screamed a lot on those first few trips. Panicked. Questioned everything. Begged Rick to turn back. But deep inside, something was awakening a small spark of bravery. Not the kind of bravery that makes you punch through walls or fly through storms, but the kind that makes you stay even when you're afraid. The kind that grows in the quiet spaces where no one sees. The kind that whispers, maybe you can handle more than you think. So Morty did what he always did. He held on. To the spaceship seat. To Rick's coat as they ran. To the thin thread of trust that maybe Rick knew what he was doing. The universe didn't care that Morty was still learning how to be seen. But the journey had begun. And whether he was ready or not, Morty Smith had taken his first step into the unknown. The early adventures weren't just chaotic. They were overwhelming in a way Morty didn't have words for. Imagine waking up in your bed one morning and falling asleep on a moon that didn't exist in your solar system. Imagine trying to concentrate on a math quiz when just the day before, you'd watched an alien civilization collapse because of one poorly timed decision. Morty tried to act normal at school. He really did. But how do you explain interdimensional radiation poisoning to your gym teacher? Or why your clothes sometimes smelled faintly of space acid? It was like leading two lives. One was painfully mundane, filled with spelling tests, awkward hallway run-ins, and endless announcements over crackling intercom speakers. The other was unspeakable, wild, and strange. He'd met creatures that defied logic, run from sentient furniture, died and been replaced more times than he liked to admit. And all the while, he was still just a kid trying to figure out where he belonged. At home, things didn't exactly settle. Rick had basically moved in building labs in the garage, blowing up microwaves, turning the family dog into a megalomaniac. Beth, Morty's mom, tried to defend her father's presence as a gift, a chance for the family to bond. But Morty knew better. Rick wasn't there to rebuild anything. He was there for himself, for science, for escape. Yet somehow, Morty kept saying yes. Kept climbing aboard the spaceship. Kept strapping in when Rick tossed him a pair of goggles and said, "Try not to puke this time." There was something addictive about it. Not the danger that part always terrified him, but the feeling of mattering. In Rick's universe, Morty saw things no one else would ever believe. He saw colors that didn't have names, planets shaped like music. He met versions of himself that were cruel, broken, brilliant, or already dead. It was as though the multiverse had whispered to him, "You're not just a nobody, Morty. You're a possibility." Still, Morty didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a bystander in Rick's personal science fiction epic, dragged along because he happened to be related and moderately expendable. And while Rick barely seemed to notice Morty's discomfort, Morty noticed everything. He saw how Rick avoided talking about feelings, how he laughed too hard at his own jokes, how sometimes after a mission, he'd sit in the spaceship long after they landed, staring into the dark with his jaw clenched and eyes empty. Morty didn't have the words for it yet. Didn't know what grief looked like in a man who masked it with genius and recklessness. But he felt it. Quietly. Deeply. And maybe that's why he stayed. Because somewhere under the shouting and sarcasm, Morty knew Rick was hurting. And in his own small, stumbling way, Morty didn't want him to hurt alone. He didn't understand the science, didn't get the equations or the theories or the bizarre experiments that Rick would rattle off during their missions, but he felt the silences in between. Sometimes on the ride home, when the ship would hum low and Rick would say nothing for hours, Morty would just sit there, not talking and not moving, just being there. That was his quiet rebellion. Not to argue, not to fix, just to witness, to say, without ever saying it, "You're not alone." And in that silent, reluctant companionship, something was forming, fragile and unspoken. A bond that didn't need to be declared, just held, gently, like glass in tired hands. So as the stars wheeled past the spaceship windows and Earth grew smaller behind them, Morty sat in the passenger seat, scared, unsure, overwhelmed, but still there. And that's where Morty's story really began. Not with a laser gun, not with a heroic decision, but with a quiet moment, a seat taken, a journey begun. As time passed, Morty began to change, not all at once, but in slow, quiet shifts. He still flinched when the ship lurched through a collapsing wormhole. He still protested when Rick handed him a mysterious syringe and said, "Don't ask questions, just aim for the neck." But there was less trembling in his voice, less hesitation in his step. Confidence didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in like morning light under a door. Soft, subtle, unnoticed at first. Morty started asking questions, not just about the gadgets, but about the why behind their trips. Why they had to steal from a baby planet. Why a clone was necessary. Why Rick never seemed to care about the destruction they left behind. Rick, in typical fashion, would groan and roll his eyes. "Because that's how it works, Morty. You don't think you do. That's why I'm the genius and you're the slightly above average meatball." But Morty wasn't satisfied with that anymore. The wide-eyed silence of his earlier days was slowly giving way to thoughtfulness, to resistance. He wasn't just the boy in the passenger seat anymore. He was watching the driver and realizing just how broken he might be. Of course, not everything had changed. Morty still clung to hope in his own sweet, unshakable way. He still daydreamed about Jessica sometimes during intergalactic hostage negotiations, which Rick was not thrilled about. "Morty, we're surrounded by squid mercenaries. Now is not the time to be thinking about prom." But Morty couldn't help it. Hope had always been his quiet superpower. In a world full of nihilism, infinite realities, and endless reasons to give up, Morty still believed there was something worth holding on to. A hug from his mom. A hot shower after a freezing alien swamp mission. A quiet moment where Rick didn't belittle him, but simply handed him a tool and nodded. And slowly, Morty began to notice something strange in Rick, too. No, Rick didn't become affectionate. He didn't give long, heartfelt speeches or open up about his regrets. But once in a while, he'd pause before leaving Morty behind. He'd make sure the airlock was sealed. He'd leave a snack in Morty's room before a trip. Small things, nothing grand. But in Rick's universe, love was coded in crumbs, and Morty learned to read them. Still, the universe was not gentle with Morty. The more he saw, the more he couldn't unsee. Entire civilizations lived and died in the span of a single mission. Friends vanished. Duplicates questioned his identity. Sometimes the worst enemies wore his own face. Reality became bendable. Morality became blurred. And yet he stayed. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was and still showed up anyway. Back on Earth, people rarely noticed the difference. To them, Morty was still just a B-average student who got too nervous during oral presentations. Still the awkward kid who flushed red when Jessica said hi. Still the little brother. Still the background noise in a family that didn't quite fit. But inside, Morty was growing roots thick and steady. In the dark corners of space, he had seen what it meant to be truly small, to be powerless, to be alone. And somehow, in facing all that, he had found a strength not even Rick had expected. No one had handed Morty a rule book for navigating a multiverse. No one told him how to grieve for alternate versions of himself. No one prepared him for the day he would be asked to choose between dimensions, lives, or people he loved. But he faced it all with quiet courage, because that's what Morty does. Not with bluster, not with bravado, but with a hesitant step forward, a deep breath, and the unshakable belief that there's still something good worth reaching for, even in the vastness of space. And so he sat one night in the spaceship once more, Rick asleep in the pilot seat, the stars wheeling outside like slow dancing lanterns. Morty looked out at the endless dark, not with fear, but with a question. What am I becoming? the stars didn't answer Morty's question. They never did. They just shimmered quietly, a million distant fires glowing with indifference, beautiful, unreachable, and always watching. Morty rested his chin on his knees, arms wrapped around his legs, the hum of the spaceship like a lullaby in the background. The silence between worlds was softer than Earth's noise. Out here, you could feel your thoughts float, like there was room to wonder. What was he becoming? He wasn't the same boy who screamed at every alien bug or cried when a mission went wrong, but he wasn't someone hardened either, not yet. There was still a gentleness clinging to him like a thread he refused to let go of. He thought of all the times Rick had said things like, "Life is meaningless, Morty. Nothing matters." Or, "This dimension doesn't count. None of them do." And Morty would nod. But quietly, deep inside, he disagreed. Maybe not out loud, not then. But he knew. He felt. His feelings did matter. That pain mattered. That even if there were a billion versions of him out there, he still mattered. That was Morty's quiet rebellion against the universe. Where Rick used intelligence to dominate the void, Morty used heart to resist it. Where Rick collapsed realities into equations, Morty preserved them in memory and how a planet felt, in the smell of a market, in the way a creature's eyes looked when it said thank you. He was still scared, of course. Every time they entered a new realm, he'd hold his breath for just a moment. Every time Rick activated the portal gun, Morty's stomach would turn a little. But those things didn't stop him anymore. Fear was no longer a wall. It had become a doorway. Sometimes late at night, after they got back from a trip, Morty would tiptoe into the kitchen. He'd sit at the table with a warm glass of milk and just be. His family would be asleep. The world would be quiet. And he'd reflect. On the planet they just left. On the life forms they helped. On the ones they couldn't save. The memories never left him. Not like Rick, who could compartmentalize, who wanted to forget. Morty remembered everything. The good, the strange, the deeply, painfully sad. And it shaped him. It shaped the way he looked at his family. He saw Jerry's ridiculous worries not as annoying, but as endearing. He noticed when Beth tried quietly to make things right with him. He appreciated Summer's sharpness, the way she could cut through emotional fog like a beam of logic. Morty started seeing Earth as something rare, a single speck in the vast multiverse where this version of his family lived, where this version of Jessica laughed a certain way, where this version of himself was growing slowly, awkwardly, but genuinely. And that was something worth cherishing. Not despite the chaos of the cosmos, but because of it. He wasn't the hero of the universe. He wasn't the smartest person in the room. He didn't need to be. All Morty had was a bit of courage, a bit of kindness, and a heart that refused to go numb even when the universe tried to freeze it over. So he stayed in the passenger seat. Not because he was weak, but because that's where the view was best. That's where you saw it all. The destruction, the wonder, the strange poetry of a collapsing galaxy. And most of all, the people beside you, the ones who kept choosing to ride along. As the ship drifted through space that night, Morty leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the stars flicker in his vision like slow, blinking dreams. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know who he was going to become. But he was beginning to understand the questions. And sometimes that was more than enough. That's where you saw it all. The destruction, the wonder, the strange poetry of a collapsing galaxy. And most of all, the people beside you, the ones who kept choosing to ride along. As the ship drifted through space that night, Morty leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the stars flicker in his vision like slow, blinking dreams. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know who he was going to become. But he was beginning to understand the questions. And sometimes that was more than enough. There's a moment in every quiet soul's life when they stop whispering and start speaking. Not to be loud, not to overpower, but simply because their silence is no longer enough. For Morty, that moment didn't come with fireworks. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. It started with a pause, the kind that sits in your chest when someone talks at you, not to you. Morty had spent so long nodding through Rick's instructions, letting sarcasm roll over him like waves on a rock. But over time, he started noticing how little space he had to breathe. How often his thoughts were dismissed. How often his feelings were treated like inconveniences. How often Rick's adventures felt more like abductions. He wasn't just a sidekick anymore. He had opinions now. He had seen too much to keep quiet. At first, his pushback came out timid and stammered. Rick, maybe we don't kill that guy just because he cut us in line. Or, are we sure this planet deserves to be vaporized? Rick would scoff. Morty. That's your problem. You're still trying to care in a system that doesn't. You gotta get over that, buddy, fast. But Morty didn't get over it. He started feeling it in his chest, the heat, an ache. A kind of righteous resistance, not the kind that burns down buildings, the kind that says, no more. No more being dragged into morally bankrupt schemes without a say. No more being used as emotional insulation, the sponge that absorbs all of Rick's chaos. No more pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. The real turning point came on a mission that wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It was just to drop off alien seeds, payment exchange, in and out. But something went wrong. It always did. The buyer double-crossed them. Rick was knocked unconscious. And for the first time, Morty was alone, truly alone, in a hostile, alien base with nothing but a utility belt and the sound of alarms echoing through steel halls. The old Morty would have panicked, froze, cried. But not this time. This time, Morty's hands were shaking. But they moved with purpose. He remembered the tricks. The layouts Rick never thought he paid attention to. He hacked the security system, reversed the blast doors, improvised a grenade from leftover tech scraps, and got them both out. Rick regained consciousness just in time to see their ship lift off. Morty at the controls, breathing heavy, eyes forward, not saying a word. For once, Rick didn't have a snide comment. He just watched. That mission changed something between them. Rick still teased, still belittled, but there was a flicker of something new behind his eyes when he looked at Morty. Not affection, exactly. More like recognition. Morty wasn't just the stuttering kid anymore. He was someone who could think for himself. Someone who could say, no. And Morty began saying no more often. No, he didn't want to destroy a peaceful civilization for fun science. No, he wouldn't lie to his family just to cover up Rick's mess. No, he wouldn't keep stuffing down his discomfort just to keep the ship moving. The more Morty spoke up, the more he learned something that surprised even him he was capable. He could navigate alien cities, negotiate with smugglers, even survive entire episodes without Rick bailing him out. But this newfound voice didn't make him louder. It made him more focused. He didn't scream to be heard. He spoke to be understood. He didn't lash out in revenge. He drew boundaries, calmly but firmly. There were days Rick would test him, pushing limits, trying to bait him into breaking down or giving in. But Morty had grown past those traps. He saw them for what they were, defenses. Rick's need to stay emotionally untouchable. Rick's refusal to admit when he was wrong. So Morty didn't play the game. He learned to walk away instead. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. Because there comes a time when even the most patient passenger needs to grab the wheel. Walking away wasn't easy. Morty had spent so long following, trusting, hoping that somewhere beneath the layers of cynicism and chaos, Rick had a plan, some greater wisdom, that made all the madness make sense. But more and more, Morty realized, Rick's plan was just survival, reaction, escape. So Morty started making his own choices. He didn't abandon Rick, not fully. There was still love there, buried beneath frustration and exhaustion. But he began carving out small moments of independence. He started setting rules. I'll go with you, but we don't kill anyone. I'll help you fix this, but you tell the truth afterward. I'm not doing this if it means hurting innocent people. Sometimes Rick ignored him. Sometimes he mocked him. But sometimes he listened. Not always with grace, never with thanks. But he listened. Morty's growth didn't make the adventures any safer. In fact, as he asserted himself more, the dangers grew stranger, the stakes higher. But there was a new strength inside him, not born from technology or genius, but from a clear sense of self. He no longer needed Rick's approval. He no longer needed to be the hero. He just needed to be honest with himself. And in that honesty, Morty found power. He stopped blaming himself when things went wrong. He stopped apologizing for caring. He stopped minimizing the fear, the anger, the grief. There were moments he broke down and he let himself. There were times he screamed and didn't feel ashamed, because he wasn't pretending anymore. He was real, messy, growing, and he was no longer alone with it. One night after a particularly difficult mission, one where they barely made it out of a collapsing reality, Morty sat on the edge of the ship, legs dangling over the side, staring at the slow swirl of a distant nebula. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Rick walked up behind him, stood there for a while, silent. Then, in a rare moment of stillness, Rick said, "You were right. About the detour, I was wrong." Morty didn't turn around, didn't gloat. He just nodded. "Okay," he said softly. It was the first time Rick had acknowledged fault. It wouldn't become a habit, but it was something. And Morty didn't need an apology. He just needed that sliver of truth, that crack in the armor. That moment where Rick stopped pretending to be invincible. In the days that followed, Morty noticed something new. Rick was still reckless, still snarky, still arrogant. But he paused more often. Looked to Morty with a fraction more consideration. Trusted him with decisions, even if he didn't say it out loud. Morty didn't need validation, but the shift mattered. He had become someone Rick could rely on. Not a backup plan, not a scapegoat. A partner. Of course, there were still fights, ugly ones. Moments where Morty wondered if this life was worth the cost. Times where he came home shaking, unsure if his soul could take another fracture. But he also came home knowing himself more clearly. Not just who he didn't want to be, but who he was becoming. Someone who cared and didn't apologize for it. Someone who stood up even when it was hard. Someone who had found a voice not to match Rick's volume, but to hold his own ground. Morty had learned something vital. Strength wasn't about who could shout the loudest or shoot the fastest. It was about stillness, about conviction, about screaming back, not out of rage, but out of refusal to disappear. And as the stars spun silently above, Morty realized this wasn't just Rick's story anymore. He wasn't the scared sidekick. He was someone who shaped the path they walked. Sometimes the battles Morty fought weren't on alien planets or in exploding labs. They happened in quiet places, in conversations, in choices, in those invisible lines he drew and redrew as he learned where his limits really were. There was the day he refused to erase an entire civilization just because Rick called it a failed side project. The aliens weren't threatening or even aware of their cosmic insignificance. They were happy. They played music with leaf-shaped instruments. They wore bright colors and danced in gravity-defying spirals. To Rick, they were a miscalculation. To Morty, they were life. He stood between Rick and the control panel. His hands trembled, his voice cracked. But he said no. Fantastic, calmly. Rick didn't argue that time. He simply sighed, pocketed the detonator, and muttered something about wasting fuel. But Morty knew that deep down, Rick respected the resistance, even if he never admitted it. There was another time on a mining asteroid in Sector 49J when Morty confronted Rick about something heavier. They had just escaped a cluster of bounty hunters. Adrenaline still buzzed in their veins, but Morty had reached his limit. He turned to Rick and asked, "Why do you keep acting like nothing matters, like I don't matter?" Rick didn't answer right away. He lit a cigarette even though the air was too thin for it to burn properly, and stared out into the glowing asteroid field. "You wouldn't like the real answer," he said eventually. "I think I already know it," Morty replied. "But I want to hear you say it." Rick looked at him. Not over him, not through him. At him. And for a moment, there was no ego, no jokes, no portal guns. Just two people in a silent corner of the universe. One too old to believe in anything. The other too young not to try. "You're the only one who still looks at me like I can be better," Rick said finally. "And I hate you for it. But I need it." It wasn't a pretty truth. It wasn't wrapped in hugs or warm music. But it was real. And that mattered more than anything. Morty didn't say, "I love you." That wasn't their way. He just nodded, and that was enough. Back on Earth, Morty began to carry himself differently. Not in a way that was obvious to his classmates or teachers, but inside in the way he made decisions, in the way he held boundaries. He stopped letting people talk over him. He started saying what he wanted, not loudly, but clearly. He no longer shrank to make others comfortable. He wasn't just reacting to Rick anymore. He was becoming someone separate. That scared Rick. You could see it in the way he double-checked the coordinates on missions Morty led, in the way he hovered awkwardly when Morty disagreed, in the way he hesitated before asking for help as if still expecting rejection. But Morty didn't want revenge. He didn't want to reverse roles or punish Rick. He just wanted to exist fully. To be treated like someone with his own will, his own thoughts, his own emotional gravity. And slowly Rick started learning how to do that. He asked for Morty's opinion more often, not always kindly, but consistently. He stopped making unilateral decisions on important missions. And once, just once, he asked, "You okay with this?" Morty didn't answer right away. He took a moment, felt his breath, checked in with his instincts. Then he nodded. "Yeah, let's do it." It was a small exchange, barely a blip in the chaos of their adventures. But to Morty, it felt like standing on solid ground after years of drifting. That's the thing about finding your voice. It doesn't make the world quieter. but it makes you steadier. And Morty was steady now. He had screamed back not to break Rick, but to hold space beside him. He had claimed his seat, not just as a passenger, but as a person with his own path. They returned home late that night, the ship humming with residual heat from the jump. The driveway was quiet. The porch light flickered, casting a dim orange glow on the concrete. Inside, the house was still. Morty didn't head straight to his room. He walked through the darkened living room, ran his fingers lightly across the back of the couch, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. The glow of the refrigerator light painted faint patterns on the floor. This was the life he always came back to. No matter how many galaxies he crossed, how many timelines blurred together, it always came back to this little home. The soft creak of the floor, the hum of the fish tank in the corner, the ghost of a laugh from earlier that week. It grounded him. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, sipping slowly. Somewhere upstairs, Summer shifted in her sleep. He could hear the distant rustle of sheets. Everything else was still. And it was in that stillness that Morty felt the weight of everything he'd become. Not in a heavy way, not like chains, but in the way a tree feels its own roots. Deep, quiet, solid. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He wasn't seeking Rick's praise or anyone else's. He had become someone he respected even if he was still figuring things out. And the best part? He had done it without losing the core of who he was. He still cared. He still believed in the goodness of people, even when Rick called it naive. He still cried when things hurt, still laughed when the absurdity of life got too big to hold in. He hadn't built walls, just doors, and he was learning when to open them and when to keep them shut. There was power in that. The next morning, Morty stood on the front lawn as the sun rose. The sky was a soft lavender streaked with gold. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir. Birds chirped. A sprinkler clicked on next door. Somewhere, a dog barked. Rick stepped out behind him, holding 2 mugs. He offered one to Morty without a word. Morty took it, the warmth settling into his fingers. They stood side by side, sipping in silence. No portal guns, no aliens, no threats. Just a rare moment of peace. After a while, Rick spoke low, almost hesitant. "You're not a kid anymore." Morty didn't look at him. He just nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I know." Another long pause. "I don't say it enough," Rick continued. "But I see you, Morty, for real, and He stopped, winced, started again. "I'm trying, okay?" Morty smiled softly. "I know." They stood there until the sun climbed fully into the sky, warming the tops of trees and rooftops. The world looked simple in the morning, gentle. Eventually, they'd go on another adventure, another crisis, another argument. That was the rhythm of their lives. But Morty knew now that he didn't need to lose himself in the chaos. He could speak. He could stand. He could be not just in reaction to Rick, but in declaration of himself. And that, more than anything, was the real beginning. Not the first portal, not the first scream, but the quiet, steady knowing that his voice mattered, that his choices mattered, that he mattered. And from that place of calm strength, he'd continue walking beside Rick, not behind him, with his own map, his own compass. And maybe, just maybe, Rick would follow sometimes too. There's a funny thing about scars, they don't always scream. Some whisper, some settle into silence so deep that even Morty forgets they're there until something stirs them. A familiar sound, a smell, a moment too close to one that hurt. And so the adventures go on. Not all of them spectacular, not all of them heroic, but every one of them left its mark. There was the time Rick took him to a planet that traded in memories. Not objects, not resources, just thoughts, bottled and sold. Morty, always reluctant but curious, had watched someone sell away the memory of their mother's voice for the price of a sandwich. It wasn't malicious, just transactional. Later that day, Rick nearly made a deal. A memory Morty didn't recognize was up for auction, a version of himself screaming at Rick, face red and shaking. Rick had scoffed and called it a waste of shelf space, but Morty watched how long Rick lingered on it. He never asked. But that night, Morty sat quietly in bed, wondering what version of himself had been so angry, so hurt, and why that version didn't survive to become the one lying in that bed. The universe didn't offer clarity. It offered options, messy, endless options. And when you're Morty Smith, those options aren't always in your favor. He once lived through the end of Earth. Not a dream, not a simulation. A real Earth, his Earth, ruined beyond repair. And so Rick opened a portal, found another version of Earth, and they stepped into it like changing shoes. Morty buried the body of that dimension's Morty in the backyard. He stared at his own lifeless face, slack-jawed and empty, and did what Rick told him. Just act normal. For days, the world felt like paper, thin, hollow. People smiled, but their eyes were wrong. School was the same, but the clock ticked differently. Every joke felt borrowed, every meal unfamiliar. No one knew what he had done, what he had buried. And no one noticed how often he blinked, hoping this was all still a nightmare. It wasn't. There were so many worlds, some where he died, some where Rick died, some where neither existed, and others where they ruled together. It was easy to get lost in the chaos, to forget where the real line between right and wrong ever stood. But Morty tried. He held on to tiny rituals, brushing his teeth exactly 20 seconds, tying his shoes the same way every time, saying thank you to the cashier at Blips and Chits, even when it was just a tired animatron behind the counter. These small things grounded him. They reminded him that some part of him remained untouched until the next adventure. Like the time they got stuck in a time-dilated dimension where months passed in the blink of an eye. Morty made a friend there, a girl who believed in stars and talked about music that hadn't been invented yet. They laughed under a sky with 4 moons. He told her things he'd never told anyone, things even Rick didn't know. And then Rick fixed the machine. It was time to go. Morty looked at her one last time and stepped through the portal. When he turned back, the world had collapsed in on itself. That timeline, and everything in it, gone. Rick didn't say a word about it. He just tossed Morty a soda and told him to get ready for school. Morty drank it silently, tasting the ghost of a life he'd almost had. Some scars don't even come from what Morty lived through, but from what he almost became. There was a moment, brief but real, when he held the power of a god. A magical crystal that predicted the future hovered before his eyes, whispering endless possibilities. He became obsessed, lost in chasing one particular outcome, dying beside Jessica, his longtime crush. Everything else blurred: friends, family, even morality. He manipulated events, killed, lied, let people die. All for a single, comforting illusion. When the crystal was finally torn from him, he could barely look at himself, not because of what he'd done, but because of how easy it had been. Rick didn't scold him. He just handed Morty a sandwich and told him to clean up, but Morty felt the dirt wasn't on his clothes. It was deeper, under his skin. The thing about adventure is that it seduces. It promises freedom, excitement, a life bigger than anything a classroom or a cul-de-sac could offer. And it delivers, but it also takes, quietly, without asking. It took Morty's ability to be surprised by wonder. When he first saw a floating city, his eyes had lit up. He used to ask questions. Now he just looked for danger. He learned to expect betrayal, to flinch when things went too well, because somewhere something was always about to go wrong. It wasn't pessimism. It was survival. Morty never talked about the planet where time looped endlessly, trapping him in a cycle of watching his own family suffer. Rick had called it a technical glitch. But Morty had relived those moments so many times that even when they escaped, he couldn't fully believe it was over. He'd wake up from dreams that felt too familiar, heart-pounding, unsure which reality he was in. Some days, the weight felt like armor, heavy but protective. Other days, it felt like a trap. Even the victories carried shadows. He once saved an entire civilization from a tyrant only to watch it collapse within weeks from civil war. Another time, he negotiated peace between two species, only to find out it doomed a third one. Rick had shrugged. That's the multiverse for you. But Morty remembered every face, every scream, every moment where he thought he was doing the right thing, only to watch it fall apart in his hands. He stopped calling himself a hero. He stopped thinking that label meant anything at all. Still, he kept going, maybe out of habit, maybe out of stubborn hope, or maybe because stopping would mean facing it all at once. So instead he patched the wounds, laughed when he could, leaned on Summer more often, even whispered apologies under his breath when Rick wasn't listening. Once, after a particularly brutal trip to a post-apocalyptic version of Earth, Morty wandered into his room, shoes still muddy. He sat on his bed, staring at the floor. The room was untouched, posters still on the wall, laundry still unfolded. He picked up a small action figure from his shelf, one he hadn't touched in years, a toy from a time before all this began. It felt foreign in his hand. He placed it back down and crawled into bed, not bothering to change. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came. That night he dreamt of simpler things, not adventures, not battles, just walking through a quiet mall with his family, eating pizza, watching a movie. When he woke up, Rick was already banging on the door with plans for their next mission. Morty didn't argue. He didn't even sigh. He just got up, put on his shoes, and followed. Some of Morty's scars didn't even belong to him, not at first. They were handed down, passed like relics from alternate selves, woven into his mind by time travel, memory swaps, or dimension-crossing echoes. There was the version of him that led a rebellion at the Citadel, a Morty who became a symbol, a threat, a tyrant, some might say. Morty caught glimpses of him in whispers, glances, and once, face to face, that Morty had sharp eyes. No stutter, no hesitation. He looked at Morty like one might look at a reflection familiar but disappointing. "Don't waste your pain," he'd said, "or you'll become someone else's pawn." Morty didn't know what scared him more, the idea of becoming like him, or the thought that maybe he already had. And yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of tenderness, moments that left their own kind of mark. He remembered a planet of sentient crystals, one that communicated through light and vibration. There, Morty had felt emotions, not through words, but through pulses of energy, joy, grief, curiosity. It was overwhelming and beautiful. They had no wars, no lies, only resonance. For once, Morty felt seen without explanation. When they parted, the crystals left a faint, shimmering mark on his arm, invisible to the eye, but glowing in ultraviolet light. A gift. Rick had laughed. They always do that. Sappy quartz freaks. But Morty sometimes sat in dark rooms with a UV flashlight, just to see it glow again. Not all scars are signs of damage. Some are reminders that you've lived, that something mattered. Still, more often than not, the scars took form in silence. Like when Morty stopped asking why. It used to be his favorite word. Why are we going there? Why does that alien want our DNA? Why do you have a chainsaw for a leg, Rick? No, he didn't always care. He just braced himself for impact. There was a trip to a theme park built inside a dying star. On paper, it sounded fun. Reality, though, had been different. The rides were unstable, powered by raw gravitational force. The mascots malfunctioned. And something about the place fed off fear. Morty got separated from Rick. In those minutes or hours, time was strange there. He faced his own reflection in ways he hadn't expected. Hallways twisted into memories. Doors opened to possibilities. Morty as a father. Morty as a villain. Morty utterly alone. He emerged shaking. Rick found him unfazed. Ah, you went into the soul sector. Yeah, that place sucks. But Morty never forgot what he saw there, what he felt. He never talked about it. He just added another quiet weight to the ones he already carried. Back home, things always looked the same. That was the strange part. His room remained untouched, his bed unwrinkled. Mom still poured orange juice at breakfast, and Jerry still fumbled with the morning news like the world was nothing but sitcom timing. But Morty had been to a world where time melted like candle wax. He'd spoken to machines that debated the meaning of love better than most humans. He'd fought, cried, and bled in places so far from Earth they didn't even have names. And no one noticed. Not really. Maybe that was the hardest scar to carry, the isolation of it all. Not the monsters or the battles, but the quiet afterward when the portal closed, and Morty had to sit with the version of himself left behind. He once stood in front of a mirror for 10 minutes, just staring, not checking his hair, not looking for flaws, just searching for who he was, who he used to be, and wondering how many more versions of himself he'd have to bury before this was all over. Sometimes Morty wished he could forget, really forget. Wipe the slate clean, start fresh like those versions of himself that never met Rick, who probably lived quiet lives with homework, soccer practice, and awkward prom nights. But even that idea came with its own sting. He once visited a universe where Morty didn't exist at all, a version of Earth where Summer was an only child, Beth worked longer hours, and Rick was gone. No one missed Morty because no one had ever known him. He didn't stay long, just long enough to feel the cold edge of absence. Not the kind that hurts you, but the kind that proves you were never needed to begin with. Back in his own world, Morty sat in the garage listening to the whir of machines and distant portal hums. Rick muttered to himself at the workbench, busy with another unexplainable project. Morty didn't interrupt. Instead, he opened an old sketchbook he hadn't touched in years. It was filled with scribbles, monsters, stars, spaceships. Some were childlike. Others were detailed, almost frightening in their precision. On one page, he'd drawn a version of himself caped, confident, smiling. He didn't remember when he'd done it. But he stared at that drawing for a long time, wondering what that Morty had believed in. The next adventure came and went, some galactic dispute, another angry race of aliens who didn't like Rick's face. Morty handled it. He always did. But afterward, when Rick offered him a high five, Morty hesitated. Then he gave a small nod instead. Not cold, not warm, just tired. Rick didn't push. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't care. That night, Morty sat out on the roof. The stars stretched endlessly above him. Familiar, cold, comforting in their way. He thought about all the versions of himself. He'd been brave, scared, reckless, hopeful. Some he'd lost. Some he never got to be. He thought about the people he'd met, the ones he saved and the ones he couldn't. The lies he told. The truths he couldn't bear to speak. Each one left a mark. And yet here he was, still Morty, still standing. Maybe that was the real adventure. Not the portals, not the battles, but the quiet act of enduring, of holding on to something real inside himself, no matter how much the universe tried to rewrite it. He lay back, arms folded behind his head, staring up at nothing in particular. The night didn't speak. It just existed, stretching out with the kind of indifference only a multiverse could hold. But for Morty, that silence was enough. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of running. He just slept. Not every mirror shows your face. Some show possibilities, versions of you that never were but could have been. And for Morty, the multiverse was a hall of mirrors, endless, disorienting, sometimes cruel, sometimes strangely beautiful. There were moments, scattered like forgotten snapshots, where Morty saw flashes of who he might have been in another life. And sometimes, when the universe quieted down just enough, he found the courage to wonder, what if I was more than just the sidekick? It started subtly. A mission went wrong, as they often did, and Morty was separated from Rick. The planet was harsh, its surface riddled with jagged canyons and crimson skies. Rick had been caught in a wormhole, temporarily inaccessible. Morty was alone. At first, panic bloomed, but something shifted. He scouted for shelter, created a fire using alien resin, found food that didn't try to eat him first. He survived. Not just barely, but well. 3 days later, when Rick finally arrived with a sarcastic remark and a half-finished rescue plan, Morty was already packed and waiting. Rick raised an eyebrow. Didn't think you had it in you. Morty didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back in their garage, the silence between them hung like fog. Rick didn't compliment. Morty didn't ask for one. But from that moment on, Morty walked just a little taller, quietly, without fanfare. Other glimpses came less gently. On one mission, they encountered a version of Morty who had left Rick, not out of hatred, but of necessity. This Morty had built his own tools, formed alliances across galaxies. He didn't brag, he didn't condescend. He simply was. Strong, capable, calm. They didn't speak much, just a brief nod as one Morty handed another a device he needed. But the way that other Morty moved deliberate sure stayed with him. Long after they left, Morty found himself mimicking the way he stood, the way he solved problems. He didn't want to become someone else. He just wanted to believe there was more in him than what Rick allowed. Then there was the mind simulation, another training tool, as Rick had called it. Morty was dropped into a false reality where Rick was gone, permanently. No gadgets, no shortcuts, just Morty, left to figure things out on his own. He'd stumbled at first, but soon he found a rhythm. He became a teacher. A scientist in his own right, he built a portal communicator that let peaceful civilizations connect. He laughed more. He cried less. He fell in love with a botanist who taught him how to listen. Then the simulation ended. Rick shrugged. Neural exercise complete. Cool, right? Morty didn't respond. He walked out of the garage and sat on the porch for over an hour, eyes unfocused, thinking about a life he'd never get to finish. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the reminder that he could be someone else, but probably never would. Rick wasn't holding him back, not entirely. But the pull of their chaotic orbit made everything else feel impossible to hold on to. Still, Morty kept trying. He asked more questions, not about Rick's machines, but about the universes themselves. He spent time alone, real-time reading, exploring, mapping out ideas that weren't rooted in survival or crisis. He helped Summer with a project about interdimensional education, spent hours with Beth tinkering in her home lab, even sat with Jerry and listened to him talk about growing up without laughing once. There was a weight to being present. Not in the way Rick defined it, jumping from one moment to the next, but truly being there, breathing slowly, listening, thinking. For a boy constantly in motion, learning to pause was revolutionary. Growth didn't arrive in some grand, sweeping transformation. It came quietly in moments Morty could have missed if he wasn't paying attention. Like when he built a translator for a species that communicated solely through color pulses, not for a mission, not to impress Rick, just because he wanted to understand them. He worked on it late into the night, drinking hot chocolate instead of energy drinks, wrapped in an old hoodie that smelled faintly of earth laundry detergent. When it finally worked, when the alien blinked in hues of deep gratitude, Morty didn't cheer, he just smiled. There was no explosion, no applause, just understanding, and it felt good. He started keeping a journal, something he never thought he'd do, not the Dear Diary kind, more like scattered notes and sketches, maps of planets, emotional reactions to places, fragments of things he wanted to remember. One entry simply read, "There was a blue sunrise over Calvus 9. It looked like hope. I didn't take a photo. I wanted to remember it the way it felt, not the way it looked." No one knew he kept it. He didn't hide it either. It lived tucked inside his backpack, between a laser pen and a half-eaten protein bar. But that journal, it mattered to him. He also started standing up to Rick more, not in loud, confrontational ways, but through quiet defiance. He said no when he needed to, asked for time off, called Rick out when he cut ethical corners, even if it meant tension over dinner. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about boundaries. And each time Morty stood his ground, he saw a flicker of surprise in Rick's eyes. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just surprise. As if Rick had forgotten Morty could do that. One day, after a tense standoff with a Federation agent, Morty ended up giving a speech. Not planned, not dramatic, and just honest. He spoke about the cost of violence, about how every blast from a gun ripples through 100 lives. He talked about loss, about mercy. The agent, hardened by decades of conflict, actually paused, called off the attack. Rick was impressed, though he tried not to show it. "You sure you're still my Morty?" he asked afterward, raising an eyebrow. Morty shrugged. "Just trying to be the version of me I'd want to meet." He meant it. The universe still tested him. There were moments when everything he was learning felt like it would collapse beneath the next crisis. But somehow, Morty started trusting his own instincts. He negotiated peace between two warring species using nothing but empathy and a shared interest in sea cucumbers. He once defused a black hole warhead by talking to it, learning its sentient coding patterns, and appealing to its fear of ceasing to exist. Rick watched both events with a strange quietness. Not sarcasm, not pride, just observation. As if he too was glimpsing a Morty he didn't recognize. One not shaped by chaos, but rising above it. But it wasn't just about heroics. There were smaller, softer signs. Morty started fixing things around the house. The broken dishwasher, the garage light, even the chipped edge of Summer's bookshelf. Acts of care, of grounding. He planted a tiny garden outside his window, alien herbs from different planets. Watched them grow in neon blossoms, each one humming softly when touched. He found joy in that. Real, uncomplicated joy. Sometimes he'd sit beside the garden at night, watching the glowing petals and listening to the faint music of their cells resonating with the stars. No danger, no chase, just stillness. These moments didn't erase what he'd been through. They never could. But they reminded him he was more than what had happened to him. That his story wasn't written in scars alone, but in choices. In who he decided to be, even when no one was looking. One night, Rick came into Morty's room without knocking, typical holding a strange device. "Want to go meet a Morty who runs his own planet?" Rick asked casually. Morty looked up from his journal. He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "Not tonight." Rick blinked. "You sure? This one's got Morty-shaped statues and everything. Might boost your ego." Morty smiled faintly. "I think I'm okay with the one I'm building right here." Rick didn't press, just gave a small grunt and wandered off. When Morty returned to his journal that night, he wrote, "Sometimes the version of you that matters most isn't out there. It's the one you grow into slowly, right where you are." It wasn't about becoming someone grand. Morty never aimed to be a legend, or a genius, or even a rebel. He just wanted to feel whole, like the pieces of himself scattered across all those chaotic adventures were slowly clicking into place. Even Rick started to notice. Their dynamic changed in subtle ways. Rick still led he always would, but now, when Morty spoke, Rick listened just a little longer. When Morty hesitated, Rick didn't immediately override him. There was space, small, sometimes fragile, but space nonetheless. During a trip to a planet where thoughts shaped reality, Rick warned Morty to suppress his imagination. "One stray idea and we're toast," he'd grumble. But Morty, instead of shrinking away, focused. He visualized a quiet forest, something stable. Trees with amber leaves, rivers that hummed, sunlight that never burned too bright. The entire space shaped itself around his thought. Rick stared. "You just built a cognitive anchor point," he said, more impressed than sarcastic for once. Morty blinked. "I was just trying to think of something calm." "Yeah, well, good job, kid." It wasn't much, but for Morty it was everything. He started making decisions based on what felt right to him, not just what Rick would do. That wasn't rebellion. It was independence. Once during a rescue mission in a collapsing reality, Morty made a split-second call to save a group of stranded beings instead of going straight for the objective. Rick had protested, but Morty stood firm. "They're people, Rick. They matter." It cost them extra time. It nearly cost them the whole mission. But later that night, as they sat nursing bruises and sipping electrolyte soup, Rick muttered, "You did good back there." Morty didn't respond. But inside, something settled. Not pride, not even relief, just peace. The quiet kind that comes when your choices reflect who you truly are. And then one quiet evening, Morty did something he never thought he'd do. He sat down and told Rick what he wanted. Not what he didn't want, not what scared him, but what he actually hoped for. "I don't know if I want to travel the multiverse forever," he said, fingers playing with a loose thread on the couch. "Maybe one day I want a home, a real one. Maybe teach. Maybe help people in one place instead of 100. Rick looked at him, expression unreadable. "I mean," Morty added quickly, I still want to do stuff, see things. I'm not saying I want a boring life, just a steady one. Rick didn't answer right away. He stood up, grabbed another drink, then paused. You're allowed to want that, Morty, even if it's not what I want. It was the closest thing to approval Morty had ever needed. That night, Morty walked through the house and just looked at things. The bookshelf he'd helped Beth fix. Summer's old science trophy, still dusty. A picture of the family from 3 years ago, the last one where everyone was smiling naturally. He realized something. His growth didn't mean leaving it all behind. It meant weaving what mattered into whatever came next. A few days later, while exploring a rogue dimension where sound had shape, Morty created a melody that built a floating bridge of notes. It was unintentional, almost like humming a tune and finding the ground form beneath you. Rick called it weirdly beautiful. Morty called it progress, because even in the strangest places, he was discovering pieces of himself. The kind of person who could blend science with empathy, adventure with purpose, intelligence with kindness. He'd been molded by chaos, yes, but he wasn't defined by it. That realization changed something in Morty. He wasn't just a character in Rick's story anymore. He wasn't even just a survivor. He was becoming a builder, of bridges, of moments, of a self worth knowing. He could feel it when he looked in the mirror. Not a different face, just steadier eyes. Eyes that knew pain, but also healing. Eyes that had seen destruction and still searched for meaning. Eyes of someone who wasn't trying to be perfect, just real. Somewhere along the way, Morty began to trust himself, not because someone told him to, not because he had proven himself to Rick or anyone else, but because he had lived enough, felt enough, been through enough to recognize the quiet wisdom growing inside him. It was in the small decisions, like helping a stranded alien child find her way home without turning it into a lesson or a detour, or deciding to stay behind on a mission just to ensure the last survivor made it safely, even though it meant waiting in silence for hours under a foreign sky. It was in the way he carried himself, in the way he breathed through panic instead of being consumed by it, in how he looked at people, really looked, not just as plot points in another chaotic adventure, but as beings with their own stories, their own fears and hopes. Rick noticed. Maybe not aloud, but Morty could feel it. The sarcastic jab softened. The unspoken trust grew stronger. There were even days when Rick asked him what he thought before acting a rare, silent nod that Morty had become more than just a companion. He had become a partner. And not just to Rick. One day, Morty was asked to speak at an interdimensional forum for youth leaders, an absurdly niche thing he never expected to be part of. He almost said no, but Beth encouraged him, said it would be good for him. Summer teased him into wearing something decent. He stood there, in front of dozens of species, all wildly different from him, and talked not about technology or cosmic diplomacy, but about courage. Not the kind that rushes into danger, he said, but the kind that stays, the kind that holds still when everything is spinning, the kind that forgives. Afterward, someone, a sentient cloud being, thanked him for his words, said they'd been thinking of giving up on their own planet's peace talks, but after hearing Morty, they'd try again. It wasn't the applause that stayed with Morty that night, it was the effect. That he, of all people, could reach someone without needing to save them with a gun or a gadget, just with his heart. Back at home, Morty began to create something he never thought he'd allow himself, a dream. Not a fantastical one, Not a delusion, but a quiet, persistent idea of a life built on meaning. A small home on a planet with good light and peaceful skies. A garden real, growing things. A lab to explore ideas and a place for others to learn and contribute. A space for laughter. A place where he could teach kids how to build, how to think, how to care. He didn't know if it would ever happen. But now, it felt possible. There were still days when he stumbled, when the weight of memory curled back into his chest like an old shadow. Days when Rick slipped into self-destruction, and Morty had to pull him out without losing himself in the process. But those days no longer defined him. He'd built tools, internal ones, to withstand the pull of those black holes. Tools forged in resilience, compassion, patience, and reflection. And late at night, when the house was quiet, Morty sometimes sat with himself, no distractions, no missions, no Rick, just silence and breath. He'd think of all the other Mortys he'd met, the ones who'd lost themselves, the ones who never got to grow, the ones still trapped in their loops. And he'd whisper, not out loud but inside, "We're not just reflections of someone else's chaos. We're more than what we've endured. We're who we decide to be." That choice, made over and over again, that was Morty's true adventure. Not across galaxies, not through portals, but inward, toward the boy who had once trembled in Rick's shadow, becoming the young man who could stand beside him, and someday, if he wanted, walk a different path entirely. Not to escape, but to finally arrive. There's a silence that creeps in when you've seen too much. Not the kind that soothes like the hush of night or the stillness of space. No, this one lingers just behind your thoughts. A silence full of noise, like a distant storm that never quite arrives. That's what Morty began to carry. Quietly. Unshakably. It started, perhaps, the moment he realized there were other Mortys. Not just hypotheticals, not just twisted versions or comic reliefs, but living, breathing selves scattered across infinite realities. Some better, some worse, some identical. Some barely human anymore. And he remembered. Every single one of them. There had been a time when the Council of Ricks kept that knowledge somewhat contained, locked in data halls or fragmented through portals, but once Morty touched the mind drive of evil Morty, something cracked open. Not just a doorway, but a floodgate. Information surged through him like a storm of mirrors, each one reflecting a different life he could have lived. He saw a version of himself who joined Rick in tyranny ruling over timelines with casual cruelty. Another who had turned away from it all, living in a field, talking to flowers that didn't talk back. One Morty had become a hero, another a martyr, another just a pair of glasses in the ruins of a forgotten Earth. And worst of all, he remembered the ones who didn't make it. The Mortys who broke, who shattered from the pressure of being second, of being a pawn, of being collateral in someone else's brilliance. He could feel them sometimes, not as ghosts, but as echoes. When he hesitated, when he doubted, when he found himself staring at his reflection too long, wondering who he really was beneath the experiences he never asked for. Morty didn't tell Rick. He didn't want to see that flicker of guilt the old man was so good at hiding behind arrogance, or worse, the apathy. Instead, Morty began keeping mental tallies, things he'd learned, things no one should know. Like how long it takes for time to fold in on itself once a memory is artificially replicated too many times. Like the precise frequency that makes reality more liquid, like the shape of a being's soul when viewed through a sixth-dimensional filter. These were not things a boy should carry. But Morty did. Because somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being just a boy. There were days when he'd try to ignore it. Go to school, eat cereal, watch reruns, try to laugh at something genuinely dumb, just to remind himself that laughter could still happen. But the weight never left. Once during a family dinner, someone mentioned dreams. Beth was talking about recurring symbols in hers, something mundane. Summer chimed in, and Jerry had a theory about stress. When it came to Morty's turn, he opened his mouth and stopped. What was he supposed to say? That in his dreams he sometimes spoke languages not yet invented, that he'd watched Earth die 57 different ways and woke up wondering which version he'd return to, that he sometimes remembered dying, and not just once. So instead he smiled. I don't really dream that much, and no one questioned it. They kept eating, laughing, living. And Morty, for all his affection for them, suddenly felt like a stranger at the table. He didn't blame them. He was glad they didn't carry what he did. But it was lonely. So incredibly lonely. Sometimes Rick would throw him into a new mission, something loud and dangerous, just to shake him out of it. And it worked in the short term. Explosions made great distractions. But even Rick seemed to sense that some wounds weren't the kind you could cauterize with laser fire. One night, after a long silence between them, Rick handed him a drink, non-alcoholic for once, and sat beside him on the roof. You know, Rick said without looking at him, I forget what I've forgotten. That's the worst part. Sometimes I know there's something I'm missing, but I don't even remember what it was. Morty nodded slowly. I remember too much. Rick exhaled. Yeah, figures. That was all they said. But it was enough. For that moment, they were 2 points of pain on the same curve, drifting in a cosmos that rarely offered answers. The memory of that rooftop moment lingered in Morty's mind for weeks. It wasn't a grand revelation or a breakthrough in their bond, but it was real. And real was rare. As the days passed, Morty began to notice something else, not just the weight of what he knew, but how knowing it changed the way he saw the world. He no longer looked at things the way he once did. A crowded hallway at school wasn't just filled with classmates anymore. It looked like a pattern, a map of probabilities and intersecting timelines, or he could almost sense the versions of them that never made it to this hallway, ones who turned left instead of right, lived instead of died, chose silence over speech, and saw their lives splinter as a result. When he walked through his neighborhood, he couldn't stop the flicker's visions of this street in apocalyptic futures, in utopian offshoots, in versions where it didn't exist at all. They weren't hallucinations. They were memories, ones he had absorbed without consent, without preparation. He would pass a tree and remember climbing it as a child, but also remember being buried beneath it, in a timeline that no longer existed. The dissonance was dizzying. The worst part was trying to act normal, pretending that the reality around him was the only one that mattered, when deep down he knew too much to believe in anything so simple. There was a night when he and Rick were stranded in a collapsing pocket dimension. They had 2 hours before it crushed in on itself like a closing fist. Rick was working furiously to stabilize the portal array, hands moving faster than thought. Morty, meanwhile, sat on a jagged rock, staring up at a sky that bent inwards like melting glass. You okay? Rick asked, not even looking up. Morty blinked slowly. Not really. Rick didn't reply. He didn't need to. There was no fix for this kind of thing. Eventually, Morty whispered, sometimes I think the universe wasn't meant to be understood, and I've just gone too far, like I Peel back a curtain and now I can't unsee what's behind it. Rick paused, then muttered, "Yeah, that's about right." It was the closest either of them came to admitting that knowledge, real, raw, overwhelming knowledge, wasn't always a gift. Sometimes it was a scar, sometimes it was a curse, and Morty was covered in it. After they escaped, he spent days avoiding the garage, avoiding adventures, even avoiding Rick. He just needed stillness. Not to heal, he wasn't sure that was even possible, but to stabilize. He walked through the woods behind his school, listened to birds, felt the wind, touched the bark of trees without wondering if they were sentient. For a brief moment, the simplicity grounded him. But even then, his mind wandered. He thought of a planet where birds wrote poems in the dirt, a universe where trees walked and whispered dreams into the ears of those who slept beneath them. No matter how far he stepped from the chaos, it followed. So he tried something else. Morty began to write. Not stories, not journals, but thoughts. Fragments. Ideas that couldn't sit still in his mind any longer. He wrote about entropy, about choice, about the silence between stars and the way regret lingers like a slow echo. He didn't share them with anyone. He didn't need to. They were his way of sorting the unbearable. One night, he accidentally left a few pages on the kitchen counter. Beth found them. She didn't say much, just looked at him for a long moment and said, "You've been through a lot more than I realized." Morty didn't respond. She didn't push, but she did start checking in a little more after that. Left him snacks in his room. Made sure he had quiet space. It wasn't therapy, but it was love, and sometimes that was enough to keep him from unraveling. Morty also started to notice that knowing so much didn't just isolate him, it sharpened him. His mind had been molded by chaos, but now it could slice through problems with ease. When Rick hit dead ends, Morty sometimes saw paths forward. Not because he was smarter, but because his perspective was wider. He'd seen more. Understood more. And sometimes that helped. And in time, Rick came to depend on that. He never said it out loud, but he started involving Morty in the planning stages more often. Gave him tools without comment. Trusted him with codes and maps he once guarded like gold. And Morty didn't abuse that trust. He never used what he knew to manipulate or control. He used it to steady the ground beneath him, and occasionally beneath Rick, too. Because the weight of knowing too much wasn't just a burden. It was also a kind of compass, one that pointed inward and asked, "Now that you know all of this, who are you going to be?" Sometimes Morty would stare at his own reflection and feel a strange kind of disconnect. Like he was looking at a version of himself frozen in a timeline that hadn't quite caught up. His eyes were the same. His posture still carried that teenage slouch. But behind them, just beneath the skin, was something heavier, wiser, tired. He wasn't old, not in years. But he had lived enough lifetimes to carry the gravity of a much older man. One afternoon, while passing through dimensions with Rick, they made a brief stop in a reality where Morty had never met him. A peaceful life, normal friends, a small, grounded existence. Morty watched that version of himself through a shop window, laughing, chatting, carefree. There was a sudden ache in his chest. Not jealousy, not regret, just longing. Rick noticed. "We don't have to linger," he said almost gently. Morty nodded. They didn't talk about it. But for hours afterward, Morty was quiet, his mind returning to that other version. The one untouched by cosmic terror. The one who didn't know about the Citadel, or the infinite curve, or the Council, or the Void. He wondered if that Morty was weaker, or just lighter. He didn't have an answer. One night, after a particularly brutal trip through a collapsed universe, Morty found himself standing alone in the garage, the portal gun in hand. It hummed softly, a gateway to anywhere. Anywhere. He held it for a long time. He thought of escaping, of slipping into a timeline where he could forget, start over, become someone else. But he didn't press the trigger. Instead, he set the gun down and sat on the floor. The tools, the inventions, the remnants of Rick's genius surrounded him like silent observers. And in that moment, Morty realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. He was scared. Not of death, not even of Rick, but of losing himself. Of becoming so wrapped in the multiverse's chaos that he'd forget the simple parts of who he was. The boy who loved stories. The boy who once worried about asking someone to prom. The boy who believed that kindness wasn't weakness. He didn't want to be hardened, or cynical, or unreachable. So he started drawing boundaries. He told Rick no more often, refused to enter certain realities, drew a line between his own well-being and Rick's reckless plans. At first, Rick scoffed, but gradually he respected it. Because Morty wasn't just resisting Rick, he was choosing Morty. And in doing so, something remarkable happened. He found clarity. The knowledge once so unbearable began to settle. It didn't vanish. It didn't become light. But it arranged itself in ways he could understand. Patterns emerged. Meanings surfaced. Not cosmic ones, not godlike revelations, but human ones. He began to understand that every version of himself, every Morty across every timeline, had something to teach him. The brave ones, the cowardly ones, the cruel and the kind. They were all pieces of a puzzle, not just of Morty, but of what it meant to be anyone at all. Because that was the truth Rick had always avoided. For all the science and portals and universes, the core of reality wasn't chaos or randomness. It was choice. Morty began to embrace that. Not just in big ways, but in the quiet ones. He started helping Beth more with chores. Took time to talk to Summer about her day. Sat with Jerry during awkward dinners and didn't mock his dad jokes. He didn't do it out of obligation. He did it because it was real. And after years of floating in a sea of alternate versions and impossible decisions, Morty needed a reality. He needed to touch base with the ground beneath his feet, with this world, this family, and this life. And slowly that weight, the unbearable knowing, became something else. A foundation, not of certainty, but of purpose. One evening, Morty found himself sitting on the roof again, the same spot where he and Rick had shared silence once before. The stars above were unusually still, like the universe had paused to take a breath. The air was cool, and the wind whispered without urgency. He wasn't escaping anything this time. He was just being. There was no crisis, no impending doom, no mission hanging over his head, just the rustling of tree leaves and the creak of shingles beneath him. Rick joined him eventually. No words, just a soft grunt as he lowered himself beside Morty, flask in hand. But even that stayed capped. They sat there for a long while. It wasn't a conversation. It didn't need to be. Some moments aren't meant for words, they're meant for witnessing. Morty's eyes lingered on a single star, dim, steady. So far away it may not have even existed anymore. And yet there it was, its light arriving late, but arriving all the same. That was Morty now. Still shining, even if parts of him felt impossibly distant. Rick finally broke the quiet. "You're different," he said, his voice low. Morty didn't look over. "Yeah. You okay with that?" Morty thought about it. Thought about everything he'd endured, everything he now carried. "I think so," he said softly. "I think I'm still becoming." Rick smirked, not his usual sarcastic grin, but something gentler. "Yeah," he replied. "That's how you know you're not me." It could have stung. Once upon a time, Morty would have taken it as an insult. But now it felt like a compliment. A rare gift of honesty from a man who rarely gave them. Morty smiled to himself. He didn't need to become Rick. That had never been the goal. He was learning to be himself in spite of the knowledge, in spite of the trauma, in spite of the infinite weight pressing down from the multiverse. He could still laugh, still care, still choose kindness. And that choice, small as it was, rippled outward in ways no science could measure. There was a kind of quiet power in that. Later that week, Morty visited a dimension he used to avoid, one where a past version of himself had made a mistake too heavy to revisit. But now he didn't flinch. He walked through the space, acknowledged the pain, and left behind a drawing, a simple sketch of a happier memory. Not to erase the damage, but to balance it. To remind that version and himself that both things could be true. There could be scars and joy, mistakes and growth, darkness and light. The multiverse hadn't changed. The chaos still churned. Rick was still Rick. The adventures would continue. But Morty no longer felt like a passenger being pulled along. He was navigating now, not with certainty, but with grace. There was a moment later where Morty found himself alone in the garage, staring at the portal gun. It blinked idly, waiting. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he walked past it, opened the garage door, and stepped outside into the real world, into the cool air of a quiet night, where nothing was trying to kill him and the stars above didn't need to be decoded. They just needed to be seen. He looked up, took a breath, and let it go. There's a strange kind of silence that follows the storm, not the silence of nothingness, but the kind filled with breath like the world is exhaling, finally letting go. Morty stood in that silence more often now. Not because everything had been fixed or because his journey was over, but because he'd begun to understand something very rare. That hope doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It had taken a long time for Morty to arrive here, this stillness, this gentler place inside himself. It didn't come from winning. It didn't come from some grand cosmic victory or finding the right dimension. No. It came from choosing, again and again, not to let what he knew define what he felt. And what he felt lately was the fragile blooming of hope. Not blind hope. Not the naive kind he once clung to as a wide-eyed kid who thought Rick could fix everything. This was older hope. Quieter, but stronger for it. A kind that knew how dark things could get and still lit a candle. He started to notice it in the little moments. When Summer smiled at him just because. When his mom touched his shoulder while passing by, grounding him with that simple gesture. When his dad, fumbling and ridiculous as always, sat beside him on the couch, just to share a bag of chips without saying a word. These weren't perfect people. This wasn't a perfect life. But that was the miracle. That there could still be love in the middle of all the chaos. He remembered a day when he and Rick had crash-landed on a forest moon, orbiting a dying star. They were stuck there for hours while Rick rebuilt the drive. Morty wandered, half lost in his thoughts, and stumbled upon something strange. A circle of glowing stones arranged by the native wildlife, not as tech, not as traps, but as art. It stunned him. In a world slowly collapsing into silence, someone had made beauty. Just because. He sat there, tracing the patterns in the dirt, and felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. That's when he realized maybe that was the point all along. Not to conquer the madness, not to outthink the infinite, but to create meaning, however small, right in the middle of it. To love, even when it hurt. To hope, even when it seemed foolish. To build sandcastles on the shore, knowing the tide will come, and doing it anyway. Morty brought that lesson home with him. He started drawing again. Quiet sketches of places they'd been, people they'd met. Not to document, but to remember. To honor. To hold something real in a sea of shifting realities. He once sketched a version of Rick smiling, not grinning, not smirking, but truly smiling. It had only happened once, in a dimension where their family had reconciled and stayed together. Morty didn't know if that Rick even still existed, but he kept the sketch. Because sometimes the memory of something good was enough to soften the edges. He also began reconnecting with the versions of himself he'd once tried to avoid: the scared ones, the selfish ones, the ones who made mistakes. He stopped running from them and started listening. Not every version was redeemable, but each one had a reason, a wound, a moment where things could have gone differently. He didn't forgive them all, but he understood them now. And in that understanding, he found compassion, even for himself. There was a night when Rick, half drunk and more honest than usual, said, "You're still soft, Morty, even after everything." Morty looked at him and replied, "Yeah, that's the part I'm proud of." Rick didn't answer, but he didn't scoff either. He just looked away and took a long sip from his flask. That, in Rick's language, was approval. Over time, Morty found that this hope inside him wasn't fragile. It was quiet, yes, but steady. The more he honored it, the more it anchored him. He learned to say no without guilt, to ask for time without shame, to cry when he needed to and laugh when he didn't. He stopped seeing his emotions as weaknesses. They were guides, reminders that even in the face of countless versions of himself, only one of them felt exactly what he did. And that version mattered. It mattered not because of what he could do, but because of who he was becoming. One evening, Morty was alone in his room when the power went out. The usual humming of the house, of Rick's machines, of glowing panels and pulsing tubes, fell silent. The sudden darkness wasn't frightening. It was calming, almost like the universe had blinked, just long enough for Morty to hear his own thoughts more clearly. He reached for a candle from the drawer and lit it. Its flame danced quietly in the corner, casting golden shadows on the walls and softening the sharpness of everything in the room. The silence grew, and Morty let himself feel everything that silence brought. He thought of all the Mortys who never got to stop, the ones stuck in perpetual chase or war or suffering. He thought of the countless lives he'd glimpsed, lived, or barely escaped from. And he wondered, not for the first time, why he was still here. Why this version of Morty, the one who saw too much and cracked but didn't crumble, why he got to rest. But this time, the question didn't come with guilt. It came with gratitude. Maybe there was no answer, no cosmic reason. Maybe he was just lucky. But if he had this chance, this one still breath in a quiet night, he would make it count. Not by running into another dimension, not by fixing the broken timelines, but by being still, present, here. He leaned back, letting the candlelight warm his face, and allowed a small smile to form. Not because everything was okay, but because he was okay right now. That had become Morty's new measurement of success. Not survival, not completion, just moments of okayness. pockets of peace in an unpredictable multiverse. He began writing a journal, not a log of adventures or interdimensional travel, but reflections, observations, quotes, tiny wonders. A bird he saw perched on a glowing antenna, a line, Summer said, that stuck with him. The way Beth's laugh sounded different when she really meant it. He wrote about memories that might have only been dreams, about moments that felt like they belonged to another version of him, but still lingered in his chest like smoke after fire. In time, the journal filled up. Then another. Notebooks stacked quietly on his desk like small shrines to his growth. No one else read them. He didn't want them to. They were for him. A map back to himself if he ever got lost again. Rick noticed the journals once. He didn't ask questions, just raised an eyebrow and muttered, "You journaling now, Morty? Cute." Morty smiled and replied, "Better than bottling it up." Rick didn't laugh. He didn't tease. He just turned back to his workbench with the faintest nod. Morty liked to think that maybe in deep down Rick understood. That somewhere inside the brilliant, broken man, there was a shard of envy or admiration. Or maybe even both. It was strange learning to live in a world that kept changing. Stranger still to find peace not in the fixing, but in the feeling, in the choosing. Morty started to understand that hope wasn't about the guarantee of a better future. It was about the possibility, the space it carved in your chest where something better could fit, even if it never showed up. It was the act of leaving room for joy, for connection, for meaning, even if only for a moment. He found himself checking in more often on his family, not out of fear that they'd vanish, but because he genuinely wanted to know them better. Each day he discovered a new layer in them, a new crack or strength he hadn't noticed before. Jerry, for all his fumbling, was unshakably loyal. Beth carried an ocean of emotion behind her confident front. Summer, blunt and fearless, was often the first to say what no one else could. And Rick was still a mess. But Morty had stopped expecting him to be anything else. He accepted Rick now. Not blindly, not without boundaries, but with awareness. Rick was a storm, sometimes destructive, sometimes strangely beautiful. And Morty had learned to carry an umbrella instead of trying to stop the rain. That shift changed everything. Their adventures didn't stop. But Morty's participation in them became a choice, not a default. He could walk away, and Rick would, reluctantly, begrudgingly, let him. That freedom created a new kind of respect between them, a new kind of bond. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was more valuable than perfection. There was a particular morning, quiet, soft, that Morty would remember for the rest of his life. The house was still asleep. Sunlight poured gently through the blinds, casting long stripes of gold across the floor. For once there were no alarms, no buzzing gadgets, no shouting across dimensions, just silence and breath and the stillness of being home. Morty sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, holding a warm cup of tea instead of his usual cereal. The steam curled like ghost stories, soft and unspoken, and the mug felt like comfort in his hands. It was the kind of morning that didn't ask anything from him. It simply offered itself. And Morty, older, softer, more present, took it in. He watched as Summer wandered in, still groggy, muttering about some dream she barely remembered. Beth followed soon after, mumbling good morning, her hair a mess. Jerry brought up the rear, humming an off-key tune. They all moved around him like planets in orbit, chaotic, endearing, uniquely themselves. And Morty smiled. Because this This was enough. Later that same day, Rick appeared out of nowhere, as he often did, wearing a bathrobe that smelled faintly of solder and engine grease. He dropped a small, glimmering cube on the table. Want to see a dimension where gravity is reversed and everyone communicates through interpretive dance? Morty looked at the cube, then looked at Rick. No thanks, he said gently. Rick blinked. Seriously? Yeah, Morty said, sipping his tea. Maybe tomorrow. Rick didn't argue, just grunted and sat down, absently staring out the window. The moment passed quietly between them, not as rejection, but as mutual understanding. Morty wasn't walking away from adventure. He was just choosing when to chase it. And more importantly, when not to. That balance, delicate as it was, had become Morty's anchor. It didn't always work. He still had days where the weight of everything he'd seen came crashing down, where the memories felt too sharp and the unknown too wide. But he'd learned to weather those days with gentleness, to rest, to let the tide pass instead of drowning in it. He had a ritual for such moments, simple, sacred. He'd go to a quiet place, usually the roof or the hill behind their school, or even just the garage at night. He'd lie down, hands behind his head, and look up, past the clouds, past the stars, past the endless what-ifs. He didn't ask questions on those nights. He didn't search for answers. He just let the sky hold him. It was during one of those evenings that Morty saw a shooting star, not the first he'd seen, but the first he noticed in a long time. It streaked across the sky like a whispered promise, gone before he could name it, and he smiled. Not because he believed in wishes, but because he believed in moments. And that was enough. Morty started talking to himself more, not in a crazy way, but in a comforting way. He'd check in. How are we doing today? He'd ask the mirror. Sometimes he'd answer honestly. Other times he'd just smile. That small ritual helped to keep the chaos at bay. It reminded him that he was still here, still trying, still choosing. He even made a habit of leaving sticky notes for himself. Little things. You did your best today. It's okay to rest. You're allowed to feel this. At first they felt silly, but over time those messages became anchors. Reminders that not every version of Morty had to be a hero or a survivor. Some could just be soft, tired, quiet. And that was just as valid. He once caught Rick reading one of the notes. Rick scoffed, muttering, "Sentimental crap." But he didn't throw it away. Morty later noticed it had been tucked into Rick's tool drawer, folded neatly. That meant more than Rick would ever admit. The final thing Morty did, the most radical thing of all, was hope out loud. He began saying things like, "I think we'll be okay," or "maybe this one turns out all right." Not as a joke, not as sarcasm, but as real, vulnerable offerings to the universe. It was terrifying at first, but eventually it became natural. Hope had stopped being a thing he carried alone. It had become something he shared, and in sharing it, it grew. Even Rick, slowly, reluctantly, started to change in small ways. Less yelling, a bit more patience. He still drank, still spiraled, still snapped. But there were moments when he paused before lashing out, when he asked if Morty wanted to come along instead of assuming. And Morty noticed. Because hope doesn't just live in the big gestures. It breathes in the pauses, in the almosts, in the tries. The garage was quiet again. No hum of machinery, no flashing portals, no echoes of distant dimensions. Just the ticking of a clock on the far wall and the soft clink of a mug as Morty set it down beside him. Rick was asleep in the chair across from him, head slumped back, mouth slightly open. A tool rested loosely in his lap, and a faint trace of oil stained the collar of his coat. He looked older than usual, smaller somehow. Morty watched him in silence, not out of fear or expectation, but with something new in his chest, tenderness. There was a time when seeing Rick like this would have scared him, made him question his strength, his sanity, his power. But not anymore. Now Morty saw the man as he truly was. Not just the genius, not just the destroyer, but the human being, flawed, bruised, trying. Just like him. Morty reached over and gently pulled a blanket from the nearby shelf, draping it over Rick's shoulders without waking him. Then he sat back and let the quiet return, thick and gentle as snowfall. He thought about how far they'd come. Not in miles or dimensions, but in understanding. He thought about the parts of himself he used to hide, the softness, the fear, the need to connect. And how now they were the parts he leaned into. The parts that made him strong in a way no weapon or invention ever could. Strength, he'd learned, wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about being open to breaking. And healing anyway. He stood and walked outside, the garage door creaking softly as it rose. The night air greeted him like an old friend, cool, calm, filled with the scent of distant rain and something green growing nearby. Above, the stars blinked lazily in their constellations. The universe, wide and strange, didn't seem so threatening anymore. It didn't need to be conquered. It didn't need to be solved. It just needed to be witnessed. And maybe, if he was lucky, cherished. Morty looked up at those stars and let out a slow, steady breath. It was the kind of breath you take after holding too much in. The kind that says, I'm still here. He thought of every version of himself he'd seen, angry, lost, broken, twisted, and sent them kindness in his mind. He didn't want to erase them. He wanted to understand them, to forgive what he could, to carry forward what he must. There was peace in that. Later that night, Morty sat at his desk with a new notebook. He opened it to the first page and, without thinking too much, began to write. This is not the end of the story, just a quiet part, a resting place. A heartbeat in the middle of all things. I am not finished, and neither is the world. But for now, I am okay. He smiled, closed the notebook, and placed it gently on the growing stack. No fireworks, no epic last words, just that. Okay. The next morning, Rick was already awake, sipping coffee and tinkering with something strange and half-finished. He didn't say much, just handed Morty a small device with blinking lights. What's this? Morty asked. Tracker, Rick said. For you, in case you ever get lost. Again. Morty blinked. That's weirdly thoughtful. Rick shrugged. You're a pain in the ass, but I'd prefer you not vanish into a black hole. Morty smiled. Thanks, Rick. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The gesture had already said it all. Later that day, Summer dragged Morty out to the backyard to help her plant something. Just a few small seeds in the dirt. They might not grow, she said. So don't get all poetic on me. Morty laughed. No promises. But as he pressed his fingers into the soil, feeling the earth cool and damp beneath his nails, he thought, maybe this was the point. To plant something anyway. To believe in something anyway. Even if it never bloomed, the act of hoping was its own kind of miracle. When the sun dipped low and the sky turned lavender, Morty sat on the porch steps, a blanket around his shoulders. The wind rustled the leaves, and from inside faint laughter spilled out. His family, loud and messy and alive. He didn't need to join them just yet. This moment, this heartbeat, was enough. And in the hush that followed, he closed his eyes and whispered something he hadn't dared to say in a long time. I'm going to be okay. Not because the world made sense, not because the pain was gone, but because he had chosen to keep going, because he had chosen to feel, because somewhere deep inside the boy who had screamed across dimensions and cried in spaces where no one could hear him, there still lived a tiny light, flickering, refusing to go out. And that, above all else, was the heart that still hoped. It wasn't loud. It didn't ask for much. But it stayed quietly, steadily. A little light in the dark. And now, dear listener, maybe it's time to breathe. To let your eyes close gently. And to know that, just like Morty, you don't have to have it all figured out. That it's okay to rest in the middle of your story, not just when it ends. You've wandered with us through the chaos, the wonder, the ache, and the love, through stars and silence, through echoes of pain and flickers of light. And through it all, hope remained. Maybe not bright, maybe not always loud, but here. Still here. So as the night wraps around you like a soft blanket and your breath slows, just know this. You've made it through another story. And somewhere in this big, beautiful universe, so has Morty. Good night, sleepyhead. We'll see you in the next dream.